We're going to talk about logistic population growth, and we are in chapter 11 of the textbook that was written by Manuel, Molles, and Sher in 2019. It's called Ecology, Concepts, and Application. You can pick that up from McGraw-Hill publishers. We've already talked about the first section of the chapter where we talked about geometric growth and exponential growth. Obviously, resources get depleted as populations get big, and so we're going to find that it's going to alter the birth rate and the death rate of the population. And there's different types of factors that will slow down population growth as the population gets large, and those are called density dependent factors. They're factors that come into play when the population size, the density, the number of individuals per unit area has gotten higher. There are other things that will limit a population sizes that are not related to the density, and those are called density independent factors. Something like climate change could often be a density independent factor that is limiting a population size as the climate becomes less favorable. Density dependent factors, though, are things that like diseases that we spread. So we're living in one of the most densely populated, within the most densely populated state in the US and New Jersey. And so when coronavirus hit, it spread very, very quickly. But also when you get more individuals, you have more competition for whatever resources you are using. So I have a couple little videos set up for you. So here we will be on Rabbit Island and talk about some density dependent factors.
Carrying capacity is an example of a density-dependent limit on growth. A density-dependent factor is a condition whose influence depends on the size of a population. It can be biotic factors, such as predation or sources of food, or abiotic, such as water supplies or habitat size. As a population approaches the carrying capacity, either the birth rate decreases or the death rate increases, or both occur. Density-dependent factors include predation. When the size of the rabbit population increases, there is more prey available for predators to find, and therefore they kill relatively more rabbits, reducing the rabbit population. Competition for food is also a density-dependent factor that limits population growth to the carrying capacity. As the rabbit population increases, there is less foliage available for all individuals. As a result, the mothers aren't as well fed, and they produce smaller litters, and more rabbits starve to death. This decreases population size by reducing the birth rate and increasing the number of deaths. Disease or parasitic infections are also density-dependent factors. When the population is larger, there is crowding, and disease agents can pass more easily from one rabbit to the next, leading to reduced survival rates.
Okay, now we'll talk about, show a little video on density independent factors.
Some factors that impact population growth are considered density independent. Regardless of the size or stability of the population, density independent factors will affect the growth of the population. Density independent factors can include flooding, extreme temperature changes, spreading of pesticides or herbicides, or a meteor hitting this island. Surviving individuals of a density-independent event will carry the only alleles in the gene pool to repopulate the island. This results in lower genetic variability in the population that develops from these few remaining organisms.
And we talked about that lower variability in a previous chapter as a founder effect of a population. I love the meteorite hitting the island. I'm so sorry for the rabbits on Rabbit Island there. So an introduction to what logistic population growth is with this little video.
Let's go back to the beginning and see what happens in nature. The rate of growth can also be calculated as the birth rate, B, minus the death rate, D. Let's assume that the average litter of rabbits per mating pair produces 8 babies. Out of those 8, 2 do not survive to adulthood. The rate of growth per the original number of rabbits was 8 minus 2 divided by 2, or 3 babies per adult. Factors other than mating success can also affect population size, G. Carrying capacity, K, is a limiting factor in population growth, as it represents the upper boundary of a population size in a particular environment because of limited resources. As the population begins to grow, resources are not yet scarce, and the population appears to grow exponentially because N is less than K. As the population size approaches the carrying capacity, in this case 20 rabbits, fewer offspring survive to adulthood, and the rate of growth, R, decreases as N approaches K. This is called logistic growth and is represented by a log curve on a graph. Eventually, the population will stabilize at the carrying capacity of the environment when N equals K and R is 0.
Unlike exponential growth, which is where the population kept growing and growing and growing, logistic population growth has the resources becoming depleted, which will slow down the population growth rate, and it'll eventually stop growing. This produces a sigmoidal shaped curve instead of a J shape that kept going up and up and up. And the point where it levels off is called the carrying capacity, which is often designated by the letter K, and it's the number of individuals of a population that the environment can support sustainably. So a finite number of resources can only support a finite number of individuals. It makes sense. So if we're going to take a look at this, let me look at time on the x-axis, and the y-axis is our population size. And so it starts off growing, even though the growth rate is not low when the population is small, there's just not very many individuals reproducing. And as you get more and more individuals, you get more and more offspring. So it starts to get faster and faster, which means this line's getting steeper. So the slope is getting steeper. The rate is going faster for the population. And then you start to compete for resources, and things are a little difficult to find enough space, and you start to slow down. So your rate starts to level off until eventually you get to a point where the population is stable. Now you might have years where it goes up or down, but you're sort of around this more stable point. And if we look at the population size, so if we go over to the y-axis and we look at how many individuals there are in the population when it's relatively stable, that is designated as K, which is the carrying capacity. So this is the logistic growth curve, whereas in comparison before, when we had the exponential growth curve, it just kept going up and up and up. So it was more J-shaped. So this is the same graph, but from the textbook, and the only difference being that they kind of sort of miss the oscillations that you would get in your population size, that sometimes you have good years and you might have more births than deaths, and then other years you're going to have more deaths than births. So it's usually oscillating around that carrying capacity. The carrying capacity then is really when the growth rate is 0. So you have a growth rate, growth stops, so the growth rate is 0. And if your growth rate equals your birth rate minus your death rate, then those have to be equal for the growth to be stable. So birth rates equal death rates. So it's intuitively obvious. Gauss looked at these growth curves for several different species in the lab, published in 1934. This is looking at the sigmoidal growth curve of yeast, and we can see that it starts to grow rather slowly at the beginning, and then it really gets to this point where the population is growing most rapidly. So this is the steepest part of the curve, is in this middle time. And then it'll start to level off, and it actually drops off. What's happening here with the yeast is that they're feeding on sugar, which produces, and they're producing alcohol as a byproduct. And so as the environment has less sugar, they have less reproduction, but they're also poisoning themselves with the more alcohol, so their own waste products are actually limiting their population to a lower number. The top left one we have also by Gauss, was looking at population growth in paramecium, and this was from the 1934 paper as well. And so you can see that it grew kind of slowly, then it grew very rapidly in the middle there, and then it leveled off. But you can see those oscillations, which I think is pretty cool. And then the bottom right, we have barnacles, and this was work done by Joseph Connell. And Connell's work on barnacles really was seeing that they were determining the population size by the space available on the rocks. So they have to, these little animals are glued basically on the surface of rocks, and so you have to have more space for more guys to squeeze in. Otherwise, you're just going to hit the carrying capacity. This is a population of elephant seals, which are on the central California coast. This is northern elephant seals. Threw it a picture for you. And this one is looking at how the population grew from the time that they reached that location and got established in the population. So you see that a few start breeding to start with, and then within 20 years of getting to this island, they have reached a carrying capacity. So they've gone from, the first female getting there to a carrying capacity of 2,000 breeding females. And it also seems to be limited by space on the beaches. The factors that are determining what's going on at the carrying capacity can be different for different species. Let's look at the equation then for logistic population growth, and we have the change in the population size over time equals your maximum growth rate, and that maximum growth rate is the same one we were talking about with exponential growth. It's the maximum per capita rate of increase under ideal conditions, and that's multiplied by your population size. So far, what we have in the equation, R max times N, that's the equation for exponential growth. So now, as we move over to the next part of the equation, this is being multiplied. So times, we're going to be multiplying it by this 1 minus n over k. K, remember, is your carrying capacity. So remember, K is carrying capacity, which is your maximum population size that the environment can support. And if we take that 1 minus n over k, that's the same thing as saying, that would be the same thing as saying k over k minus n over k, which is the same, if we just rearrange it algebraically, it's the same as going 1 minus n over k. This whole thing is dealing with this environmental resistance of some sort. So what's going to happen is we're going to take exponential growth, but then we're going to modify it by this one term. And so the way this additional term works, when n is near the carrying capacity, so if we have if n equals k, then that term n over k would equal 1. So then we have n over k equals 1. 1 minus 1 is 0. The 0 times, so if 1 minus 1, if this term becomes 0, then 0 times anything is 0. The growth rate of the population is 0. So then dn dt equals 0. So as the population size increases, the logistic growth rate becomes a small fraction of the growth rate till eventually at the carrying capacity that should be 0. If the population size is really small, so if n is close to 0, then n over k is close to 0. So 1 minus n over k is 1, so it's 1 times that. So it should be, at small populations, close to exponential growth. The other thing we find when we look at this equation is that this rate, the change in population over a change in time, is going to be highest when population growth is going to be highest when the population size is k divided by 2. So it's going to be at half the carrying capacity. So after you get a population bigger than half the carrying capacity, the growth rate is going to slow down. This term, n over k, so the ratio of the population size to the carrying capacity, is called environmental resistance. So if n equals k, environmental resistance is going to force this, it's going to be at 1, and it's going to force your population to stop growing. If n is greater than k, then n divided by k is greater than 1. So 1 minus n over k is going to be a negative number. It's going to be less than 0. And you take a negative number, multiply it by the first term, you get a negative number, which means your population will decline. So let's just go over this again. We've got logistic growth here. We already had looked at exponential growth. Exponential growth, if you remember, the rate of population growth equals the maximum growth rate times the population size. And here with logistic growth, it starts out the same. But then we're going to multiply it by this additional term. So we're going to multiply it by 1 minus n over k, where n over k is your environmental resistance. So we start off with exponential growth and we're just adding in an additional factor. If n is at the carrying capacity, then that term becomes 0. So dn dt is 0. If it's greater than the capacity, the carrying capacity, then that 1 minus n over k is negative. So the population growth will be dn dt is less than 0, so that it's going to decline. And if the species population is really small, so let's say it's close to 0, then n over k is close to 0, so dn dt is close to just R max times n, which is exponential growth. So it starts out close to exponential growth, and then the faster it grows, the eventually it gets to a point where it starts to have these density dependent effects kicking in, slowing down that growth. So this is figure 13 out of the chapter, where they just show you the equation and lay out how everything works. So the logistic equation gives you the rate of population change, and it's going to be a function of three variables that we're dealing with. We're dealing with R max, which is that intrinsic rate of increase. So that would be your rate of increase in an ideal environment, like in exponential growth. It's also a function of your population size, and population size is shown in the equation in two places. The population size will make the growth rate higher, but then when you get the population size over here, remember there's a negative number in front of this, then it's going to have a negative effect, and the bigger the population, the more negative that effect becomes. And then it's also going to be a function of the carrying capacity. So we've got three different variables going on here. And as the ratio of the population size to the carrying capacity changes, it's going to affect your population growth if n over k, if n equals k, so if the population size is at carrying capacity, that becomes 0. If it equals the carrying capacity, that becomes 1. So 1 minus 1 becomes 0, and 0 times anything is 0. Your population change will stop. So remember that R max was your intrinsic rate of increase. So that's your maximum growth rate in an ideal conditions. And then we can look at your actual population growth rate as the realized per capita rate of increase. And that is basically taking your ideal and then multiplying it by this environmental resistance equation, so the 1 minus n over k, so 1 minus the population size divided by the carrying capacity. So this is basically the slope of the line on the logistic growth curve, as the slope of the line changes as we go across the population growth curve. So here the x-axis, and it's kind of hidden in the middle of the graph here, but the x-axis is the population size, and the y-axis is this intrinsic rate of increase. And so we know at the carrying capacity, the population is not growing. So the population growth will be 0 when we're at the carrying capacity. So we know that that's happening. We also know if the population is really small, there's nothing stopping it from growing exponentially. So at a low population size, you're at this R max, this ideal, this intrinsic rate of increase. So when we actually plot this, then we can see we start with a very high growth rate in small populations, and it's linear. It just follows this line till we get to the carrying capacity. Then when you get over your carrying capacity, we find that the line will drop down here. So when we go higher than the carrying capacity, we find that the population is going to be in decline, and so you will find a negative growth rate. So if the population size, once again, if the population size is greater than the carrying capacity, then n over k is greater than 1. So that 1 minus n over k is going to be a negative number. It's going to be 1 minus something bigger than 1, so you end up with a negative number down here. This was a study looking at exactly that with Daphnia pulex, which is water fleas. These are little guys. You could probably put like 2 dozen water fleas on your fingernail. Well, maybe not 2 dozen, maybe a dozen water fleas on your fingernail, depending on your fingernail. But they were growing all these separate populations at different densities. So they would have like 1 per cubic centimeter, ranging up to 32 per cubic centimeter. So that is what the x-axis is showing you. And then we can see that the per capita rate of increase, the realized per capita rate of increase, drops then with population size. So we assume logistic growth model, you would have the highest per capita rate of increase at the lowest population densities. And yes, they found it was positive as long as you had densities of 16 individuals or lower. So we know somewhere between 16 individuals and 24 individuals is going to be the carrying capacity, because in densities of 24 and 32 individuals per cubic centimeter, they found that the populations declined, that the per capita rate of increase was negative. So really, environment limits the growth of populations by modifying birth and death rates. And so we can understand how this phenomenon actually happens. Given what I've just shown you about the realized per capita rate of increase, you should be able to go back then and look at those logistic growth curves we saw earlier, such as this barnacle one, and you should be able to interpret what's going on in that curve by looking at the changes in the realized per capita rate of increase. So take a look at both of those. You should be able to relate. So remember, on the per capita curve, the x-axis is n, and that n is the y-axis on the barnacle one. So if we're looking at low population sizes, we're looking at what's going on in this part of the curve. If we're looking at what's happening at high population sizes, at large population sizes, you're going to be looking over here on the right side of the barnacle curve. We talked about Galapagos finches in chapter 10. Charles Darwin saw these finches in the 1830s in the Galapagos Islands, and then in later years, people have looked at them as a source of inspiration and information regarding natural selection, how it works in nature. Peter Grant and Rosemary Grant, we talked about in chapter 10, had worked on these birds for over 40 years, and their students worked on them, and they got colleagues to work on them. So there's a lot of information on these guys. And so we're going to talk about a study that was looking at the medium ground finch, which was a dominant finch on Daphne Major, which was one of the islands, and they found that after a drought in 1977, the population dramatically dropped from 1,200 individuals to 180 individuals. That's an 85% decline in just 1 year. Now, a few of the birds might have gone to some of the other islands, but most of these birds starved to death. Their food plants, they normally eat the seeds from the plants, and they just couldn't get enough seeds. And so we found that the population dropped enormously. On the other end of the spectrum, in 1983, they had about 10 times the average amount of rainfall, and the population grew to over 1,000 individuals at that point, so that the population growth actually was the extra seeds that the adults would be able to eat. But then there was also, because of the extra rain, there was a whole bunch more caterpillars, and that's what they feed as an important protein source to their young. So it wasn't just the seeds, but they're also looking at what they were feeding their young. So this was what happened. The top picture is before the drought, and the bottom picture was after the drought. See, the plants are just decimated. And this is their data. So we have across the x-axis, we have the year. On the y-axis, we have the population size of the finches. And then we have a second y-axis, and this was the rainfall on the right-hand side. And so the blue is showing you the number of finch, or so the rainfall is in blue, which makes sense. and the number of finches is in green. And so we can see that there was very, very little rainfall in 1977, a huge drought. And we didn't have much rain the year before that, and the population of finches was just decimated. It just dropped drastically during that period. And then when we had a huge rainfall in 1983, we had a really high rate of population growth. And this is looking at the survivorship of the young and comparing 1981 to 1983. So in 1983, we had all of the rain. And in 1981, the caterpillars that they feed to the young, there were very few caterpillars in 1981. And then 1983, there was a huge increase in the number of caterpillars. And that coincided with a huge increase in the number of baby finches that were surviving. This is a different species of Galapagos finch. This is the cactus finch, and we can see they had the same impact of rainfall on them. On the years where they had very low rainfall, they were not able to produce as many eggs per pair, but during the years of high rainfall, they got more egg clutches per pair. So the x-axis here is your rainfall, so that's your independent variable, and your dependent variable are the number of egg clutches per pair. So we can see how the wet and dry cycles are going to affect the populations of the birds. In turn, the birds also impact the populations of the cacti. This is the cactus finches that actually will feed on the cacti quite a number of different ways. They'll eat the flower buds, they'll open them up and get the pollen. They'll eat the nectar. They will get the flowers, the pollen out of the mature flowers. When they do that, they can actually pollinate going from flower to flower. They'll eat the seeds, they'll eat the seed coatings, they'll eat insects that living on them. But they will also disperse the seeds as well. So they have positive and negative effects. But they will damage a lot of the flowers. When they open the flower buds, they will snip off bits and pieces of the stamens or the stigmas, and then the flowers can't produce their seeds. So here we're looking at the number of flowers that are damaged. So we've got across the x-axis, we've got the years, and then the y-axis is the number of flowers. The red dots are the number of flowers that were damaged, and the blue are the total number of flowers. And so we can see the extent of damage is going to increase when we have fewer flowers. So there's just fewer flowers available to them. And so they're going to also have fewer food sources available to them on those dry years. And so when the cactus flowers are abundant, the damage by the finches is low, but when the cactus flowers are not terribly abundant, the finches will do a lot more damage, which is going to be detrimental to the cactus population. This cactus is an Opuntia, it's a prickly pear. They were also affected by El Ninos, so when they're getting damage from the environmental factors and damage from the cactus finches, it can have some sort of feedback where the finches are affecting the cacti, and the cacti are in turn are infecting or affecting the finches as well. So you should be able to answer the concept review questions at the ends of the sections in the chapters. Why can we be sure that all animal and plant populations are under some form of environmental control, given what you know about logistic growth? What appears to set the carrying capacity for the medium ground finches on the Daphne Major Island? Why might medium ground finches population responses to short-term increases in rainfall be different than long-term increases in rainfall. So think about whether it's just a year or two where you have higher rains versus if you had decades where you had higher rains. How is that going to have a different impact on the populations? Think about why the rate of logistic population growth at very low population densities is almost the same as exponential growth. So we looked over this equation. You can always go back and rerun that part and make sure you understand why at low population densities it's almost the same as exponential growth. So the top equation is logistic growth. The second equation is exponential growth. So remember that is linking to this environmental resistance part of the equation. So this is looking at a growth of a game fish. You think about any animal that we harvest for the wild, and we usually have strict controls on how many you can take. Well, why would you want to keep your game fish population size near half of the carrying capacity, but not much lower? So why do you want to keep it somewhere around the middle of the curve if the carrying capacity is up here, but you wouldn't want to be keeping your population size lower than that. So think about when we were looking at the steepness of the line and when you would get the most offspring produced. So the last part of the chapter is going to be talking about the application of this to looking at human populations. Also, make sure you look at investigating the evidence number 11, and that is looking at how we estimate the number of species in a community, not just the population size of those species in the community.